With the drought that we have in UFC content right now, I wanted to take a look at some of my favorite fighters. If you followed the channel, you would know that I recently uploaded a video, my top 25 favorite fighters of all time. Well, there was one fighter within my top, not even just 25, top 10 that I missed, and this is what inspired this video. Today, I wanted to continue talking about some of my favorite fighters, so even if you didn't watch the first video, this video will still be relevant to you. I'm going to just talk about some fighters that I like. We're going to go through the fighters that I missed, we're going to go through a few honorable mentions, and then I'm going to talk about my favorite fighters from 25th all the way to 40. We're adding 15 fighters to this list, and that kind of takes care of my involvement with this sport in a sense. There were all the fighters that I constantly sit down and I actively cheer for. We're going to get into all of them in just a second. Before we do, I do want to say hello, everybody, and welcome back to another video. If you were new here, my name is Kyle. I'm your guy with too many YouTube channels. Apologies if you could hear some deep breathing today. Having a bad day with allergies. Anyways, the fighter that I missed that I actually wanted to include within my top 10 list, so I don't know exactly where we're going to throw him within the top 10, it's Neil Magny, guys. If you've been following the channel, you might know that I would consider myself Neil Magny's biggest fan because I feel like nobody's a fan of this guy. In saying that, I don't mean like everybody just hates on the dude. I'm just saying like, who do you know that says Neil Magny is one of their favorite fighters? Well, this guy does. I love watching Neil Magny fight. I understand in his older age now, he hasn't had the best fights or best performances, right? But Neil Magny is such an underappreciated fighter. I have always called him one of the BMFs of the sport. He's seemingly a great guy. And of course, I don't know these fighters, like actually know them just from what we've seen online. He seems like a really great guy. He'll take on anybody, anywhere, anytime, and that's a very respectable mindset to have in this sport. He's a veteran. There is just so much to like about this guy. Every single time that he comes into the cage, I am sitting down and I am actively cheering for Neil Magny. I wouldn't be shocked if, like, I know I meme about it on the channel a little bit, but I wouldn't be shocked if I was legitimately Neil Magny's biggest fan. I love watching this guy fight. I like him as a dude, and I can't believe which... Out of all of the fighters to miss, to be honest with you, out of all the fighters that I could have missed on that list, I'm like, dude, of course it's Neil Magny. The fighter that nobody would like necessarily put on their list, I'm like, of course I miss Neil Magny. But honestly, like, I would have included him in my top 10. I don't know why. He just slipped my mind at the time. So, as we talked about, we went through some honorable mentions in the past video. These are fighters that necessarily I wouldn't look at them and say, hey, these guys are my favorite fighters, but in the future, like years down the road, perhaps I can throw these guys as like, they get more into the spotlight, as they win more fights, as they're more involved in the sport. I can see myself one day saying, hey, you know what? These guys are my favorite fighters. So we went through 1 to 5, and I have 5 more fighters for you this time around. Number 6 of honorable mention being Cade Ruotolo. This is a guy that I have been following in One Championship Grappling for a very, very long time. He recently has been making his MMA debut. Well, I mean, he did, but he had a couple MMA fights, and he's doing great so far in the MMA division. Now, this dude, talk about easy to cheer for. Very wholesome, very respectful, very good at what he does. He is an absolute pleasure to watch, and any single time that Cade and Tye Ruotolo are on the screen, I find myself cheering for these guys. Their happiness is pretty, like, it's pretty contagious. Like, they're pretty wholesome, nice winners in my opinion, but I do find myself liking Cade more than Tye, and of course, Cade is the one who got involved in MMA, and that's why he did end up making this list. Let's continue on to number 7 for my honorable mention is Joaquin Buckley. This dude is really, really growing on me. You know what's funny is when he entered the sport, I actually didn't really like Joaquin that much, but he is so active, taking on the toughest fighters in the division, and I love his, I don't want to say persona online, but I love what he's doing online, from him making the memes, like Buck versus the Cuck was hilarious, him just partying before the fights. Like, I feel like whenever I see Joaquin Buckley around, he's just having a good time. He's fun, he's energetic, he takes on the toughest fights, and he's improving every single time that I see him. He wants to be a champion. He wants to change his life, take care of his family. This dude is somebody that I find it also very, very easy to cheer for. I think by the time that Joaquin Buckley starts to, like, end his career, I think that I can find myself saying, like, Joaquin Buckley is one of my favorite fighters. Continuing on with the number 8 for honorable mention, we have Dricus Du Plessis. Here's the thing. I don't know too much about Dricus as a guy, but I love the trash talk. For the same reason that we talked about the last video, how much I enjoy watching Colby Covington for, like, just what he brings and the chaotic energy that comes with him to fight week, Dricus Du Plessis has made 3 fighters cry. That in itself is top tier level trash talk, and I am, guys, if you guys know me, I am a big, big fan of beef in MMA. I'm a big fan of fighters trash talking each other. I love that Dricus Du Plessis, like Colby Covington, there's a line, and there's points where he continues and just goes past the line. He's very funny in that sense. He is so much fun to watch in the cage. He's a great champion. He is, and to be honest with you, he is a pretty respectable guy in victory, and we haven't necessarily seen him in defeat, but you get the point that I'm saying. Like, Dricus du Plessis is really, really climbing the ranks for my favorite fighters, okay? Continuing on with number 9, honorable mention, Islam Makhachev. This dude has been putting on more fun fights as time's gone on, and he is so low-key funny that I don't know if it's just because, like, you get the kind of humor, like the Dagestani Habib humor. You know what kind of humor I'm talking about? I feel like Islam's the best at it. Like, with DC talking about, I bring your, what, I don't remember exactly what he said, but something along the lines of, like, we brought our sons here and we smash, and Islam goes, like, he's just unintentionally funny. In the cage, he is a blast to watch. He's one of those fighters that doesn't just use his wrestling. He has a very, very complete and evolved MMA skill set. I can find myself, like, putting Islam Makhachev by the time he's done in my top 25 list. Continuing on with the final honorable mention that we have over here is Du Ho Choi. This dude's fun. This dude's fun. And like I was kind of talking about with Kate Ruotolo, he's a really fun winner. Of course, I feel like we've all been paying attention to him since he had those wars with Cub Swanson, but ever since, I just found myself, like, cheering for the guy. We know the war's in him, and he's still improving every single time that we see him. At the time of recording this video, he just had his very dominant win over Nate the Train Landwehr, and he's still shining in his career. We missed him when he was gone for his military service, and I love rooting for this guy. This guy is very, very fun to have around. Du Ho Choi is going to be one of my favorite fighters one day. Now, I did choose 15 extra fighters to put on my list of favorite fighters, and I feel like going up to 40, that's pretty well all of the fighters that I had to talk about. But for this, we aren't going to count down. We're going to count out. We're going to count up all the way from 26 all the way to my favorite fighter, number 40. And if you're sitting here and thinking, like, okay, you have 40 favorite fighters, that's wild. I have been watching this sport for over a decade. I've seen countless number of fighters in multiple promotions, so I think this is actually a very relatively small list. Let's continue on to number 26, Marlon Moraes. Every time he's been around in the cage, he tries so hard. He tries so hard to get the job done. He hasn't always gotten the job done, but he makes his opponents go through hell in that first round. He's had a lot of really fun highlight reels. His fight against, like, Merab Dvalishvili, for example, was a blast. Like, this dude has been part of some of the greatest wars in the bantamweight division, and he's had me screaming on many, many occasions. I also just really like Marlon Moraes, man. Like, I miss him so much in the UFC, and I miss him so much in his prime. Loved watching Marlon Moraes. Let's continue on to number 27, Rampage Jackson. Now, here's the problem. I wish that I could put Rampage Jackson higher. I liked Rampage when he was fighting. Don't get me wrong, but he wasn't nearly one of my favorite fighters. It's funny because after he retired, I started liking Rampage Jackson more. For example, I listen to the Jackson podcast fairly regularly. I love what he has to say. I love his mind. I love his humor, and I've always loved his humor. Don't get me wrong. Like, Rampage Jackson was always a blast to watch, whether it's an interview, whether it's in the cage, whether it's a post-fight speech. This dude was always really, really fun, and I found myself only liking him more as time's gone on. Let's continue on to number 28, Kenny Florian. My favorite commentator that I miss and nobody else talks about. Kenny Florian was so good at his job, but not only was he a good commentator, he was a fantastic fighter too. Was he the best fighter? Absolutely not. Did he have some amazing fun fights? 1000% he did. I like Kenny Florian as a fighter, I like Kenny Florian as a commentator, and I like Kenny Florian as a person. I have been listening to the Anakin Florian podcast literally since episode 1. I went there initially for Kenny Florian, and I stayed for the great content. Kenny Florian is a fantastic, fantastic fighter, in my opinion. I love watching him, always cheer for him, and I'm so glad that he's finding success outside of the sport. Let's continue on to number 29, Jan Blachowicz. This dude is one of those guys, kind of like I was talking about with Glover in the last in the last video. I like to see him win. He just seems like such a nice, wholesome guy, just going through life, wanting to do his very best in the sport. And he's a great knockout artist. The legendary Polish power he gave birth to. And at his old age, he's only gotten better, which is crazy. One of those guys that I find it insanely easy to cheer for. I wish that he was more popular than he is, because I think he's a very, very underappreciated fighter in general. He's, to use Lucas Tracy terms, if you want to talk about a crafty vet, then this is absolutely a crafty vet, Jan Blachowicz. Like, this guy is so much fun. I love watching him fight, and I find myself cheering for him all the time. Let's continue on to number 30. Another very underappreciated fighter, in my opinion, Jimmy Rivera. Kind of like I was talking about Marlon Moraes, I loved this whole era of the bantamweight division. Jimmy Rivera, while he still is active, the problem is I do miss him in the UFC. I miss him in the UFC. He wasn't always the best fighter. Kind of like I can say the same thing like Marlon Moraes. But I like him as a guy. He's always putting his heart out there, and he has had some absolute dogfights in there. Very underappreciated. I miss Jimmy Rivera in the UFC, and I will always find myself cheering for Jimmy Rivera. Let's continue on to number 31, Bryce Mitchell. I wholeheartedly believe, and memes aside, okay, I know, and I don't say that I agree with this, okay, we have the Bryce Mitchell, the seatbelt stuff. I'm not saying I agree with that, right? Everybody was laughing at him recently. But I do believe he is a very genuinely good person. He's fun to watch in the cage, and that post-fight speech he just did with Joe Rogan was a perfect example about it. If you watched him through Media Day and Fight Week, throughout any of it, he was so grateful to be there, so respectful to everybody, and the fact that like he was even just apologizing to Joe Rogan in the way that he did in his post-fight speech, like talking about being a man, wanting to get money, and very grateful for his opportunity in the UFC. More fighters need to be grateful for what they have in the UFC. This man walks through life with a amazing attitude, in my opinion. And I see in some comments saying that Bryce Mitchell's officially reached enlightenment, which, I mean, like, that would make a lot of sense to me, to be honest. But I believe that out of all of the UFC fighters, he is one of the most genuine, kind people. And I will always find myself cheering for Bryce Mitchell. I don't agree with everything the dude says. Like, you would see some of the wild clips that, like, for example, Media Day, the seatbelt thing. But I do really enjoy and wish the best for Bryce Mitchell. Let's continue on to number 32, a fighter that is unpopular, in my opinion, to be a big fan of, and that's going to be Henry Cejudo. You know what's funny is when Henry Cejudo actually came onto the scene, I really didn't like him. I really hated him, but it's when he started his gimmick and started like, I remember even just the first time it started where he's like, as some of you might know, I do have an Olympic gold medal, because he did talk about it a lot, and then he became into the King of Cringe. When he entered the state of the King of Cringe, I personally thought that was really entertaining and really hilarious, and it was to the point where, like, the cringe was so bad that it was funny. And of course, that was always the goal of it, but Henry Cejudo was also a phenomenal fighter. He put on a lot of great fights for us, and I really enjoy him outside of the UFC as well. I enjoy his analytical breakdowns. I enjoy watching him wherever he is. And Henry Cejudo, I never really understood the hate too much, to be honest with you. I think he's a great fighter, and I think he's a great guy. Continuing on, another very underappreciated fighter at number 33, we have Curtis Blades. I still do believe maybe like I've said this throughout the course of the heavyweight division and how it's evolved, but now I might say like, okay, Volkov, Aspinall will be at the top. I've always said that Curtis Blades was one of the best heavyweight fighters of all time. He just lacks having a chin. That's a big problem. I feel so bad when Curtis Blades loses because he puts the work in. He comes in such great shape. He fights with his heart, but he can't, unfortunately. He has a little bit of a chin issue, but we're not going to break down exactly Curtis Blades' fight style over here. I've watched his story a few times, and I think that he's just a very likable guy. I think he's like a normal guy who just wants to fight because that's his way to make money. Curtis Blades I think he's awesome. I like Curtis Blades. I find myself cheering for him every single time that he's around. So Curtis Blades, very underappreciated fighter, puts on some very good fights, and I hope one day that this man actually becomes champion. If we want to talk about fighters that like I would love to become champion, Blades would absolutely be there. Let's continue on to number 34, Gilbert Melendez. Very fun in the cage. He has had some scraps over the years. Every single time this guy has been in a really good fight, I found myself sitting back and I'm like, okay, Gilbert Melendez is fighting again. Like, yeah, you know, when the cards would come up, the more that I watched Gilbert Melendez, I was kind of like how I was talking about Beneil Dariush. I found myself sitting back and I'm like, okay, every time I see this Gilbert Melendez guy, he's putting on a pretty good fight. It's typically pretty fun to watch. And after so long, I just kept on cheering for Gilbert Melendez. I was really hoping that he would get the title over Showtime back in the day, but unfortunately, he didn't get the job done. That was hype for a fight, by the way. But Gilbert's in the commentary now, like he's in the space. He's doing a great job there as well. I've always liked Gilbert Melendez. I liked his energy. I liked his fight style. Number 35, Frank Mir. I loved watching him in the heavyweight division. Frank Mir also is one of those guys that I do believe is a really good guy. I like how much he talks about his family. I listened to his podcast when it came out for a very long time, but actually, like, it kind of, I don't know if it's still going because I just randomly haven't listened to it in a long time, but I love his technical breakdown of fights. I loved him in the octagon. I loved what high-level jiu-jitsu he brought into the octagon. His heart was there. The fight style was crazy. Frank Mir always brought a really good time when we were watching him, and I do miss watching him fight. He's in the GFL now, so I don't imagine that'll go too well, but regardless, I love watching Frank Mir fight. A little bit more of the same. Number 36, Junior Dos Santos. This was one of the fighters that I first became a fan of. I always talk about Carlos Condit being that guy, but Junior Dos Santos was right there. When you talk about wholesome winners, we talk about Junior Dos Santos. I still, like, sometimes with my friends, we will still meme Junior Dos Santos when he's saying happy birthday, like happy birthday. You know, when he just got the whole crowd doing it. But Junior Dos Santos walking around, he put on some amazing, amazing fights. The power was so real. Chris boxing for the heavyweight division. He put on some absolute wars, had all of the heart in the world, and he's one of the most wholesome winners of all time. The smile when he gets victories going, I'm so happy. Like, I love watching Junior Dos Santos fight. I've always loved watching him fight, and he is one of the first fighters that I ever became a fan of. Unfortunately, I guess time has gone on. I did like more fighters better than Junior Dos Santos, but I miss him, man. I miss the Dos Santos and Velasquez era. Continuing on, number 37, Clay Guida. There's a big rumor within people like the MMA space that Clay Guida is a really, really wholesome and respectful guy, despite of like how crazy he acts in the cage. From what I've seen, in an outside perspective, that only seems to be true. Plus, everybody's kind of saying it, so why wouldn't it be true, right? And in saying that, like, I mean, like, you can't believe everything you hear, but you hear a lot of fan interactions talking very positively about Clay Guida. Even him, like, in his walkouts for his fights, he's taking the time out of his day to say hi to anybody who wants to, like, take a picture of him. We've seen stuff like this with Clay Guida all over things like Fight Week. He always puts his heart out there in the cage. I love watching him fight. I love watching him grapple. I love that he's still doing it so well in his old age. I know he just lost to Chase Hooper, but he even just put on like a fantastic fight against Chase Hooper. I love watching this guy fight. I love that he's one of those veterans that are still succeeding. I don't really want to see him retire. He always brings the energy. He's always fun. And like I said, everybody talks about this guy being a really, really great guy. When I watch this guy just with any fan whatsoever, I know, like, you know, it could always be for the camera, but I like to think that Clay Guida is also a really, really good guy. So I cheer for Clay Guida every time that he's around. It's going to be sad the time where he does end up retiring. Let's continue on to Yuri Prochazka at number 38. Aura. Talk about aura. When this guy comes in, he drags you through a war like you've never been through before. How can you not sit here and like a dude that fights like that? Yuri Prochazka, he brings in that whole samurai attitude. Every single time that we see him, he's kicking some trees. Like, we never see that Yuri, like, we never see any clip of Yuri just, like, going about his regular life. It's always him doing some sort of samurai thing. And I know, like, he lives and breathes the samurai lifestyle, but he brings it back into the cage. And when he's in that cage, he puts on a show. How can you not love a guy who puts his body through what he puts his body through in order to get a victory over an opponent? I love watching Yuri Prochazka fight. I always cheer for Yuri Prochazka unless he's fighting Glover Teixeira. Let's continue on to number 39. I don't know if this one's unpopular. Let me know what you guys think. Paul Craig. Is he the best fighter? No. I love the energy he brings. I love he comes in like with the face paint, ready to go with the weigh-ins. He's bringing the energy when he's walking out. He's looking at you like he's going to absolutely murder you. He is always live to get the victory. The submission threat is always real. I get that he's a little bit older now and he's past his prime, but he's had some crazy comeback wins. Like, I find excitement whenever Paul Craig is around. And I love the energy, like I said, that he brings. I think he's an okay guy. I usually find myself cheering for Paul Craig. I love a good Paul Craig fight week. Continuing on all the way to number 40, we have Rafael dos Anjos. Like I was talking about with Neil Magny earlier, one of the true BMFs of the game. He has taken on anybody, anywhere, anytime. He was a great champion. I still remember the day where he became champion. I remember exactly what I was doing. Like, I love watching Rafael dos Anjos fight. He's a very respectful guy. He brings in all the skill of the world. He's still performing at his old age, and I hope he's okay because at the time of recording this, he just had his recent injury, but there's nothing we can do, man. When a fighter like Rafael dos Anjos is on the scene, you can't help but respect him because he is one of those guys that always risks his ranking in order to take on a fight. Great company man for the UFC. He is in it to be the best fighter in the entire world, and Rafael dos Anjos has done nothing but prove that as time has gone on. He was a great champion, very underappreciated, very underrated fighter. I miss the RDA era, man. I miss that old lightweight division. But regardless, guys, that is going to do it for the rest of my favorite fighters. If you haven't already seen this video, you came across this organically, then check out this video right here where I go through my top 25 favorite fighters of all time, where it's missing Neil Magny, guys. Thank you so much for being here. Take care.